When Victor Jameson died, the world lost a legend. I lost a role I never applied for, the silent partner. They called him a genius, a visionary, a man who saw the future and bent it to his will. His name was etched into skyscrapers, whispered in boardrooms, and sewn into the labels of things people couldn't afford. But behind every great man, there's a shadow. That was me. The news broke on a Tuesday morning. Heart failure. Painless, they said, dignified. They didn't mention the locked drawer in his study or the private vault in Zurich. They didn't talk about the contract written in our blood and buried in a safe no one knew existed. And why would they? Legends don't have loose ends. They don't leave behind ghosts with legal claims. I didn't cry. I didn't speak. I watched the world grieve a man I helped build, line by line, risk by risk, lie by lie. The media spun his myth one last time, and I stayed where I always had, out of frame. But something shifted when the will was read. It wasn't what he left behind, it was what he didn't. No mention of me. No mention of us. Just a name I didn't recognize, and an empire I was never supposed to touch. This isn't a story of revenge. It's not about justice. This is a reclamation of identity, of truth, of a kingdom I helped create and watched slip through my fingers. And now I'm done being the silent partner. Clarissa always knew how to fill a room. She didn't enter. She arrived, a walking crescendo in heels and conviction. People orbit her, still. Back then, I just watched. And if I'm honest, I didn't mind. Not at first. My name rarely made it past the guest list. She was the one whose image lit up magazine spreads, who sparred with anchors on talk shows, who claimed credit for strategies we shaped together over midnight coffee and secondhand cigars. We was always just... Clarissa, said louder. I told myself I didn't need the spotlight. I told myself I was proud. I told myself a lot of things. We met in grad school. She was lightning, and I was the wire. She pitched ideas. I made them plausible. I'd write the decks, scrub the projections, rehearse the pitch with her until she could breathe it in her sleep. She'd walk into the meeting, close the deal, and throw me a glance across the room. That glance used to be enough. My career, what there was of it, withered quietly. I'd left a consultancy offer on the table, a job in Singapore I never even told her about. My name wasn't on the company letterhead. Not legally, not publicly. But the systems, the supply chain pivots, the data. That was me. I buried my voice under hers like infrastructure under skyline. I remember the first crack. It wasn't a fight, it was a moment. An interview she gave in Monaco. She called herself self-made, a woman alone in a man's world. I watched the clip from the back row of a panel she forgot to invite me to. My name wasn't mentioned. My face didn't flicker in the background. It was the beginning of a vanishing act. Mine. We stopped working late together. She hired a PR team. I became too cautious, too quiet, too much of the old model. But she kept me close, just close enough to feel irreplaceable, just far enough to be invisible. People asked what I did. I said strategy. I said internal. I said nothing you'd have heard of. There was always a promise, silent and unspoken, that my time would come. That when we'd sold the company, when the IPO hit, when the time was right, I'd be beside her in the light. But light, I learned, casts the darkest shadows. The night before her Forbes cover dropped, I stood in our kitchen. She still called it ours, and held the early copy. She looked perfect, powerful, singular. I asked if she mentioned me in the interview. She didn't answer. We both heard the silence. By then, I knew better than to ask again. Clarissa didn't betray me with malice. She betrayed me with momentum, swept forward by ambition, the way a current forgets the shoreline it erodes. I stayed because I believed I was essential. That belief became my prison. And when the walls finally cracked, all I found was my own voice, echoing back, unfamiliar and thin. The world called her a force. I was the equation beneath her thunder. And now that she's gone, now that her legacy is being parceled out and rewritten, I find myself staring at the void she left behind and wondering if, for the first time, I'm ready to step into it. The call came late, a Thursday, just past midnight. I had just slipped into bed, the kind of deep, exhausted sleep that only comes after a night spent reading projections no one would ever look at. It was Michael's voice. sharp and clipped, the kind that always told me when something was off. "He's gone," Michael said, his words barely a whisper. "Victor's dead." It took a moment to process the words. Victor Jameson, the man who had been the heart of everything, the architect of the empire, the force that had shaped everything we'd built, died of a heart attack. Unexpected. Unseen. Clarissa was asleep beside me, her breath steady, unaware of the storm unfolding outside our walls. I sat up, the weight of the news pressing down, my mind spinning through the possibilities. What did this mean for her? For the company? For me? The years of devotion, of sacrifice, of being a shadow to her fire. Would they all unravel in a single phone call? The funeral was a blur of mourners, speeches, and carefully orchestrated eulogies. Clarissa played the widow to perfection. Her grief, polished, sculpted into something the cameras would love. People cried, but I watched her. The way her eyes darted across the room, her smile just a little too tight, a little too forced. I was used to this version of her, composed, controlled, always in control. The reading of the will came days later, in a glass and chrome boardroom that smelled faintly of expensive cigars and history. The lawyers, stoic and neutral, stood at the front, shuffling papers that seemed to weigh more than the building itself. Clarissa had insisted on being there. She was, after all, the widow, the heir apparent, the company, the brand, the empire. It was hers. She'd built it with Victor, and she knew she would inherit it all. She was already running the show, even if no one said it out loud. But as the lawyer cleared his throat and began to read the final clauses, something shifted. The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with anticipation. "I, Victor Jameson, being of sound mind and body," the lawyer began, "do hereby bequeath my entire stake in the company to—" Clarissa leaned forward, her eyes wide, a small, almost imperceptible smile forming at the corners of her mouth. The pause, the hesitation, was deliberate. "To my personal assistant," the lawyer said, "Alexander Hale." The words hung in the air like an electric shock. A beat of silence. Clarissa's breath caught, her hand clenching the armrest of her chair, nails digging into the leather. She looked as if the ground had been ripped from beneath her, leaving her dangling in a world she couldn't control. I'd never seen her like this, not even when the press turned on her, not when she'd lost clients or investors. This was different. This was raw. This was betrayal. I didn't feel the same shock. I knew, in some corner of my mind, that this was coming. Victor wasn't a man who left things to chance. And over the years, I'd watched him. How he'd pulled me into meetings, how he'd taken my advice, how he'd trusted me in ways that no one else ever did. He had seen something in me that Clarissa hadn't. She had always been the face, the voice, the name on the marquees. But Victor had been different. He'd understood the work I'd put in, the quiet, tireless hours that had never been acknowledged. And now, as the reality of the will settled over us, it wasn't just his death that felt final. It was the end of something else. The end of my shadow life. Clarissa's disbelief was palpable. Her eyes darted from the lawyer to me, and I could see the gears turning in her mind, the calculations, the damage control. She had always known how to spin a situation. But this was different. This wasn't a press release. This wasn't something she could spin into a new narrative. She wasn't prepared for this. The lawyer continued reading the will, but my focus was elsewhere. On Clarissa. On the way her composure faltered. On the shifting power dynamics in the room. The empire that had once been entirely hers, that she had always assumed was hers, now belonged to someone else. Not her. Me. Her shock mirrored my quiet triumph, though I didn't let it show. It was subtle, a shift in weight, a momentary shift in the axis of our world. For the first time, I wasn't just a shadow. I was the inheritor. The first few days felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. I wasn't sure which. But the moment I stepped into Victor's office, the office that had always been a sanctuary of decision-making, the place where the world seemed to shift with each choice he made, I knew things were different. It was quiet. Not just physically, but in the way the space seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to fill it. And I was expected to fill it. Clarissa's absence from the office had become a low hum. She was still there, of course, a shadow behind the scenes. The face on the company's website, the name at the top of every board meeting. But I had the power now. And slowly, I was starting to understand what that meant. Not just the authority, but the weight, the responsibility. I didn't immediately overhaul the place. There was no dramatic rebranding or new slogans plastered on walls. No expensive consultants to tell me how to spin the company's story. I didn't need it. I just needed to listen, to observe. My first day as CEO wasn't spent in front of a camera or in a high-profile meeting or shaking hands with investors. It was spent walking through the forgotten corners of the company, the departments no one ever thought to check in on, the teams buried behind spreadsheets and servers, the creatives who had never gotten the time or space to actually create. I started with the engineers. They had been overlooked for years, their input nothing more than a footnote in a business plan. I walked into their chaotic, cluttered room and they stopped, surprised. No one from the top had ever come to their part of the building. They didn't expect much, but I didn't offer grand promises. I just asked questions. How could we do better? What resources did they need? What ideas had been waiting in the wings for too long? At first, they were guarded, but when I didn't rush them, when I took the time to listen, when I genuinely asked about the things that mattered to them, they started talking. Slowly at first, but the walls came down. The next day, I moved to the marketing department. I didn't wait for a meeting to be scheduled. I didn't email a request. I just walked in. The employees there were used to the routine of endless product launches, rebranding campaigns, and glossy surface-level presentations that didn't speak to the heart of the company. They were tired. We talked for hours. I asked about their frustrations, what was missing, what made them proud, what were they afraid of. There too was the same undercurrent. They wanted more than what they'd been given. They wanted a purpose that aligned with something deeper than just making a sale. Word spread quickly. I didn't need to micromanage. I didn't need to issue directives from my office or promise sweeping changes that would never come. I just showed up. I listened. And bit by bit, people started to see me, really see me, for the first time. One afternoon, a senior developer stopped me in the hall. He had always been distant, wary even when I'd been the shadow behind Clarissa. But now, he looked me square in the eye, his voice steady but full of gratitude. "I didn't think you'd be this different," he said. "But you are. You're one of us." It wasn't a declaration of loyalty, but it was a start. A small one, but a start. People were beginning to trust me, not because of my title, but because of my actions. I wasn't about the optics. I wasn't about the headline. I was about what mattered to the people in those departments, the unsung heroes of the company who had never been seen. By the time the first major company-wide meeting rolled around, I'd already made changes, subtle ones. A few tweaks to the messaging, yes, but also to the culture. I spoke with conviction, but not as a man trying to prove he belonged. I spoke because I believed in what we could do together. I focused not on selling an idea, but on showing them a vision. Not one of domination, but of collaboration. Not one of competition, but of community. The applause at the end wasn't as loud as I expected, but when it died down, I saw it. The glint in the eyes of the people who had finally seen their work acknowledged. They weren't clapping for me. They were clapping for the future we could build together. And that was enough. I had become the face of something real. Not a brand, not a product, but a movement. And that was just the beginning. The idea came to me one night as I was sifting through old photos in the back of Victor's office, dusty folders filled with press clippings, contracts, awards. But there, tucked between a leather binder and a stack of forgotten memos, I found something that felt different. It was a letter. The handwriting on the envelope was faded, barely legible. It was from a man I didn't recognize. His words were raw, unpolished, but they carried a weight that felt almost too heavy to ignore. "I know you don't remember me," he'd written, "but you saved me once, and I've been trying to repay you ever since." The letter spoke of a partnership, an unseen moment where Victor, always the visionary, had extended help to someone at a crucial time. No press, No fanfare, just action. It was a theme I had come to realize was woven into everything Victor had built, helping people without needing recognition. I couldn't shake the thought of it. I thought of all the quiet hands that had shaped this company, the janitors, the interns, the underappreciated teams, the employees who had never seen their names in lights. They had worked tirelessly in the shadows, holding the fabric of everything together. And that's when it clicked. We could do more than just sell products. We could change lives. We could honor the unsung, the unseen, the ones who made everything possible, but were never acknowledged. That was how the Victor Trust was born. It wasn't about building a foundation with a corporate logo stamped on it. It wasn't about charity for the sake of optics. It was about real transformative giving, the kind that would have meant the world to Victor, the kind that made a difference when no one was watching. We launched the Trust with a modest, heartfelt announcement. A new wing of the company dedicated to supporting the underserved, the overlooked, the employees who had given years of quiet devotion, the families struggling to make ends meet, the small businesses trying to get a foothold. It was a call to action for anyone who had ever felt small or invisible. And soon, the applications started pouring in. The letters were nothing short of emotional. They were filled with stories of hardship and hope, of dreams that had never been realized, of lives put on hold. There was one letter that stuck with me. A mother of two who worked multiple jobs just to keep a roof over her family's head. She wrote of her son, a gifted artist who had dreams of studying design but could never afford the tuition. She begged for help, not for herself, but for him. Reading that letter, something inside me shifted. I realized that this wasn't just about giving away money. It was about changing destinies, offering a bridge where there had once been only a chasm. The Trust's first grants went toward scholarships, microloans for small businesses, and support for families facing tough times. But it didn't stop there. Every penny felt like a ripple, each one a small act of kindness that had the potential to create waves of change. I would never have been where I was without those small, unseen contributions. And now, through the Victor Trust, I could pay forward what had been given to me. It wasn't about being the face of something grand. It was about creating a legacy of heart. And for the first time, I wasn't just honoring Victor's vision. I was creating my own. The doorbell rang late in the evening. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened it, there she stood. Clarissa, her posture stiff, her face pale, and a look in her eyes that I hadn't seen in years. Vulnerability. For a moment, neither of us moved. The distance between us, both physical and emotional, felt like a canyon. I wondered if she could feel it too, the space between what we were and what we had become. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her hands clutching her purse like it was a lifeline. The city's hum filtered through the street behind her, but it was quiet in this moment. We were alone, and the weight of that silence pressed down hard. "Can I come in?" she finally asked, her voice small, hesitant. I stepped aside wordlessly, and she entered. She hadn't been here in months, but somehow the place felt different now. The house had taken on a sense of belonging, of warmth. It wasn't just the walls or the furniture, it was the life that had grown here, the life that no longer depended on her. She sat down on the couch, eyes scanning the room but never really looking at anything. It was a moment before I sat across from her. We both seemed to be gathering the words, but neither of us knew where to start. "I heard about the Trust," she said, quietly, her voice still carrying a trace of the confidence she used to have, but now layered with something softer. "I saw the changes you've been making. It's impressive." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't praise I was looking for, not from her. I wasn't even sure I wanted it. "I never thought—" She stopped herself, swallowing. "I didn't think you'd do it, the way you're doing it. It's different. I thought you'd falter, I guess. I thought the company would fall apart without me." I let the silence hang, trying to resist the pull of old feelings, the instinct to placate her, to tell her everything was fine. But everything wasn't fine, and I wasn't going to pretend it was. "You were right," I said simply. "I would have faltered. But it wasn't just you. It was me, too." I let myself be a shadow for so long. I forgot what it was like to stand in the light. Her eyes flickered at that. The truth stung. I could see it in her face, in the way she clenched her jaw. She wasn't used to hearing me speak this way, not about her, not about us. I should have seen it earlier, she said, her voice cracking. I should have seen how much I didn't realize how much I was taking from you. Her hands twisted in her lap, and for the first time in a long while, I saw her as human, as someone who wasn't invincible, who wasn't always in control. I came here to apologize, she continued, for everything, for not seeing you, for thinking I could just take everything and not give anything back. You were right to step away. I didn't deserve it. I wanted to feel anger or betrayal, or even satisfaction in this moment, but I didn't. I just felt weary, like a part of me had already let go a long time ago, even if she hadn't. You never saw me, I said softly. Not really. You saw someone who made your life easier, who helped you shine, but you never saw the person who stood beside you, the one who sacrificed everything, quietly. You didn't see that because it didn't matter to you. I was just part of the backdrop. Her face twisted in pain, and she shook her head, almost as if she could physically reject the words, but they were true. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, until finally, she spoke again. I know I was selfish, and I hate that. I hate how I treated you, but I'm asking for a chance to fix it, to come back, to help again. You're doing great things now, but maybe I can help too. Maybe we can do this together. The hope in her eyes was raw, and it broke something in me. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to reach out, pull her close, and tell her everything would be all right. I wanted to pretend we could pick up the pieces, that we could go back to what we once had. But I knew better now. I had seen the difference in myself since she left. I had learned what it was like to stand on my own, to lead without fear of being overshadowed. I had discovered a version of me I hadn't even known existed, one that didn't need her to validate it. I can't, I said, and even though the words came easy, they felt like stones in my chest. I can't have you back in my life, not in the way you want. I've moved forward, I've built something new, and I don't need to go back. Her eyes watered, but she didn't cry. She just nodded, slowly, like she knew deep down that this was coming. Maybe she'd been waiting for this moment longer than I had. I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. And just like that, the weight of years, of sacrifices, of silence, of unspoken words, began to lift. Not because we'd found closure, but because I had finally found myself. She stood, her steps slow, and she left without another word. This time, there were no promises, no attempts to fix what was broken. Just the quiet understanding that we had both changed, that we had both outgrown what we once were. And as I watched her walk away, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel relief. I just felt resolved. The coastal house was nothing like the sleek corporate apartments I'd once inhabited. It was small, unassuming, and perched on the edge of a cliff, where the sea stretched out endlessly, never-ending and unpredictable. The waves, relentless in their motion, mirrored the peace I'd begun to find in myself. I'd bought it with no grand intention other than to have a space that was mine, a place to breathe, to think, to just be. Living alone was different. There was no rush of meetings, no constant buzz of emails or calls to answer. There were no expectations to meet, no role to play other than the one I had written for myself. The house became a sanctuary, not from others, but from the parts of myself I had left behind, the shadow, the assistant, the quiet voice behind the curtain. Here, I was just me. The mornings were slow, filled with the rhythm of coffee brewing, the wind tapping gently against the window, and the sun rising over the ocean. I would take long walks along the shoreline, breathing in the salty air, feeling my feet sink into the cool sand. It wasn't loneliness that gripped me during these moments. It was intentional solitude, a chance to remember who I was without the constant noise of others' expectations. Every evening, I would sit by the large windows, watching the sky paint itself in hues of orange and pink, and think of Victor. I never had the chance to thank him properly, to tell him how much his belief in me had shaped my life. But I felt his presence in these quiet moments, in the lessons he had passed along, not through speeches or grand gestures, but in his quiet trust, in the way he had always seen beyond the surface. I was grateful for him, for everything he had taught me, for the chance he had given me to step into the light. And in the peace of this place, I found a new kind of strength, one that was gentle, grounded, and whole. The idea behind the Backbone Initiative had started as a whisper, a thought, a seed planted in the quiet spaces of my life after Clarissa's departure. If the Victor Trust was about lifting up the forgotten, then this new project would focus on something equally important, giving recognition to the quiet strength of those who worked behind the scenes, those who held everything together, often without anyone noticing. The initiative was simple. We would fund the unsung heroes, the caregivers, the teachers, the laborers, who gave their all with no expectation of accolades, the ones who held their families and communities together, whose work was invisible yet essential. The trust provided grants, scholarships, and support for those whose resilience and dedication often went unnoticed by the world. The stories that came in were powerful. One woman, a nurse who had worked through the pandemic with no personal recognition, wrote about the exhaustion and the isolation she felt, but also about the children she had saved, the families she had helped heal. Another was a mechanic who spent his life fixing cars so his small town could keep moving, so people could keep their livelihoods. These were the quiet warriors. Their strength was built not on fame or fortune, but on the simple acts of perseverance. And then, at one of the annual events we held to showcase the awardees, something shifted. A woman who had received one of the grants stood up to speak. Her voice, shaky at first, grew stronger as she spoke about how the grant had allowed her to start a community kitchen, feeding hundreds of families in need. "I never expected to be noticed," she said, her eyes bright with emotion. "But because of this support, I've been able to make a difference in ways I never imagined." As she spoke, the room fell silent, each person in the audience feeling the weight of her words. It wasn't just her story that resonated. It was the truth behind it. The quiet, humble strength of someone who had built something out of nothing, who had changed lives in ways far beyond anything that would ever be published in a newspaper. I didn't need applause. I didn't need anyone to recognize me. This was the work that mattered. This was the full circle. Not just reclaiming my own voice, but using it to lift others up, to celebrate their power and their quiet courage. As the night wore on, I realized something profound. The real legacy of the Victor Trust and the Backbone Initiative wasn't just about helping others. It was about reminding everyone, including myself, that sometimes the strongest people are the ones who do the hard work without expecting the world to notice. And that was enough. The applause that followed felt like a blessing, not for me, but for them, the quiet heroes. And in that moment, I knew I had found my place in the world. The phone calls came less frequently, the emails more distant. In the months following our final conversation, Clarissa's name appeared less often in boardrooms and executive circles. She had once been the face of the company, the one everyone turned to. But now, she was just another name on the corporate radar, a fading star whose light had dimmed, not because of any grand scandal, but simply because the world had moved on. I never took pleasure in watching it happen. There was no satisfaction in seeing her career dwindle, no triumph in her slow fade from the public eye. In fact, I felt a quiet, melancholic understanding of the process. The thing about being overshadowed by someone like Victor was that you were always cast in someone else's shadow. And once the shadow moved, there was no place left to hide. It was around that time that her application to rejoin the company arrived on my desk. She hadn't changed much. The letter was as polished and confident as always, full of promises and plans as if nothing had shifted between us. But I had. I wasn't the man who had been content to stand in her shadow, who had craved validation. I was no longer the assistant. I didn't respond with a letter of rejection. I didn't send a scathing email or plot some dramatic corporate coup. Instead, I simply left the letter on my desk, untouched. No call, no reply, no drama. just silence. The poetic justice of it all lay not in grand gestures, but in the quiet realization that she had lost her place not to me, but to her own choices. The role she had once commanded, the position that had once been hers, no longer held the meaning it once did. And in the end, that was the most powerful message I could give her. I chose peace over pettiness. I moved forward with purpose, while she, it seemed, was still searching for something she could never reclaim. The years passed by like waves, slow and steady, and in the quiet of my coastal home I began to reflect more deeply on the journey that had brought me here. The trust was thriving, the Backbone Initiative had expanded, and yet there was still something else. Something that called to me when the mornings were still and the house was silent. I had always been a student, a shadow in the corner, quietly observing. But now, the time had come to write my own lessons, to teach what I had learned from my own quiet growth. I traveled, seeking new places and faces that would expand my perspective. There was a stillness and solitude that I had come to cherish, a space where I could think, reflect, and ultimately create. And so I began to write. The book started slowly. At first, just fragments of ideas, then pieces of the stories I'd heard, of everyday heroes, of unsung strength, of the quiet resilience that shaped not just companies, but entire communities. I called it the Backbone Blueprint, a guide to creating a life of purpose, not based on what the world demanded, but on what you could give. I wasn't looking for fame or acclaim or a bestseller. I wasn't even looking for recognition. What mattered was the message, that we all have the power to change the world, not by being loud or dominant, but by quietly doing the work, by honoring the unsung, by lifting others as we rise. I was no longer the assistant, no longer the shadow. I had become a teacher, not of grand principles, but of simple truths, the kind that come only with time and reflection. The light, I realized, was never something to be sought. It was always there, waiting to be recognized. And now, it was mine to share. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the ocean. From the deck of the house, the world felt vast and still. The waves whispered against the rocks below, a rhythm that matched the quiet beat of my heart. It had been years since I first came here, seeking peace, seeking a place to rebuild. Now I realized I was no longer searching. I had found it. I leaned against the railing, feeling the cool evening air brush against my face. The world seemed to pause in this moment, suspended in time. There were no grand celebrations, no fanfare, just the simple, serene knowledge that I had arrived at a place of deep contentment. I used to be a shadow. I had lived in someone else's light, and I had let it define me. But now, the light was mine. I had earned it not through revenge or reclaiming a throne, but through becoming whole. As the last rays of the sun faded into twilight, I whispered to the quiet world around me, I used to be a shadow. Now I write the light. Justice wasn't about retribution. It wasn't about taking back what was mine. It was about letting go of the past, accepting who I had become, and honoring those who had helped me along the way. Victor, the forgotten heroes, the quiet strength that surrounded me. In the stillness of the night, I understood. True triumph isn't in the loudest victory, but in the quiet acceptance of one's own worth. And in that peace, I found everything I needed.